Welcome to another episode of the Confessions of a Recovering Landlord podcast, where you'll learn the secrets commercial landlords would prefer you not know. I'm your host, Jan Gibbons, along with my co-host and experienced commercial real estate broker, Bob Gibbons.
That's me.
Brought to you by REATA Commercial Realty, where we exclusively represent users of office and warehouse properties. Landlords have representation. Do you? Welcome to our podcast again. Today's topic is called critical dates. When we first started fleshing this out, I thought we were going to talk about me and Matt Damon, and then I found out it's something else completely different.
Matt Damon wouldn't deserve a woman like you.
What a sweet boy. Okay, so you have found your client their perfect space. They've signed on the dotted line. They've had their tenant improvements. They've moved in. And they receive a notice about a critical date that they missed. Da-na-na-na. Now what?
Well, that depends. What was the critical date related to?
Well, pick any of them. Rent payment, option to renew, tenant improvements, maintenance obligations, notice for period of termination. I have a plethora from which to choose.
All right. Which one do you want to start on?
Well, let's start with something more like tenant improvements, the allowance that was given by the landlord to finish it up. You've got to spend it by this time, or is it? That would be what would be the first thing I think you would miss on a lease you just signed.
Yeah. So let's, I think that's smart. Let's back up to where you've signed the lease and there's construction to be done and a move in to be done, all that kind of stuff. So there's an awful lot of things that have to be done once you sign the lease. The first, let's just say you've signed a lease for space that's already finished out the way you need it to be, and there's no construction to be done. Well, you still have to plan the move. So when is that going to occur? Who's going to do it? What are the conditions and the restrictions or the regulations around moving in? So usually the property manager of the building will be the primary point of contact for a tenant once a lease is signed. It's no longer the leasing agent. It's now the property manager. And the property manager will be the person that should send over all those documents that you need to sign. Let's say it's an office building and it's going to be a multi-tenant office building with a card key access. Well, the property manager is going to need to know the name of every employee that you're going to issue one of those cards to. If they're going to park in the garage, the property manager is going to need to know the name of the person, what kind of car they drive, what the license plate number is, to issue them access to the garage. Maybe using the same card as the card that gets them into the building, maybe a different card, hopefully the same. Most of the time it is the same for decent buildings anyway. So there's an awful lot of those kinds of things that go into just sort of the setup for the tenant moving into the space that needs to be addressed. I mean, what name do you want to be on the plaque at your front door and on the directory in the building? Exactly how is that going to be spelled? The name of the entity that's on the lease may not be the name that people do business under. So you need to make sure that that's correct. So there's all kinds of things like that need to be addressed. If it's an industrial building, warehouse, let's say, or even certain medical spaces, and it could be in office spaces, but not as often, there may be signage outside the building that is mounted onto the building that needs to be done. So, you got to order the sign. You've got to get that approved by the landlord. You got to get it approved by the city. There's probably a permit that you need to have from the city to be allowed to put your sign on the building at all.
And are you saying that would fall under critical dates? You have to have it up by this date or you don't get to do it?
Possibly. Certain leases can say, not so much in office and warehouse, but in retail sometimes, which, we try to avoid working on retail, but sometimes those will say that you must have your sign up and installed by a certain date or before you open up for business or something like that. So it can get to be very, very specific when it comes to those kinds of things. Other things that you might have to do if it's an industrial building, you might need to order a dumpster because you may be responsible for your own trash removal. In some buildings, you're going to be responsible for your own janitorial. So you're going to either need to, get your 14-year-old kid lined up to, clean it once a week or hire a janitorial company to do so. So all these kinds of things are things that really should be thought of and considered and discussed during the time you're negotiating a lease, and sort of be prepared for those so that once the lease is signed, you're not starting flat-footed. And so there's all kinds of things like that we could talk about. Now, if you're then dealing with construction as well, now you have plans with an architect. You've got a mechanical, electrical, plumbing design engineer, usually coordinated by the architect, but, could be separate. You have to bid those out to general contractors. You have to get your plans approved by the city and by the landlord and get a permit from the city. So, you start doing all those kinds of things, and the timeline can really stretch out. And so when you negotiate the lease, if you're using a good tenant rep, corporate real estate advisor like REATA Commercial Realty, then those things have been considered in the negotiations. They're part of the negotiation. So I had a conversation with Christy in our office today on my drive to my lunch appointment, where we were talking about all this kind of stuff. And we were talking about, on the deal she was negotiating, the landlord is requiring the tenant to be the one to manage the construction. So the tenant has to hire and sign the contract with the general contractor to do the work. So we were talking about, all right, who's going to coordinate that? Are they going to hire an outside third-party construction management company? Are they going to do it themselves? Who exactly is going to do this? Because the client's from out of state. So that raises other issues of complexity.
So how do you build this in if you miss a critical date? Say that commencement's November 1st. I couldn't get completion done because I've ordered HVAC from Korea and it didn't come in time. Can I ask the landlord, please slide back my commencement date? How do you build in for issues?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what the issues are and the way you've negotiated the lease. But if we know, and we should know, when you sign a lease, you should already know whether you as the tenant are going to be responsible for managing the construction process or the landlord is. Either way, you need to have already had plans either done or, getting close to done. And hopefully you've already bid that out to general contractor 1 or 2 or 3 to have an idea of whether or not you're even on budget. Maybe the landlord's giving you $40 a square foot in tenant improvement money, but is that enough? You don't have any idea if you haven't done some plans, at least a pricing plan, and had a general contractor look at it and give you an estimate on the price. So all that hopefully has already been done, and you will have hopefully negotiated the lease appropriately. So if the tenant is responsible for construction, then we will have negotiated a certain period of time, 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, whatever the amount of time is that's needed for the scope of work, in which that's the construction period. Then when the construction is finished, or the outside date, whatever the date is where the commencement occurs, whether you're finished with a space or not, when that occurs, then the lease commences and the rent schedule starts. So you'll start paying rent, or your free rent will start burning off at that point. And you don't want to be burning off free rent if you're not using the space. So hopefully the tenant has been competent enough or hired somebody competent enough to handle the construction to avoid missing those dates. But you're right. If we have a situation where some product item has not been received, and we had this happen during COVID or in the aftermath of COVID, where the supply chain was so messed up, we couldn't get air conditioning units. Well, that was through no fault of the tenant or even the tenant's general contractor. There's no fault of the landlord either. But there is this little thing in a lease called force majeure. And force majeure basically says that if one of the parties to the lease is required to do something and is prevented from doing so due to some situation beyond their control, like availability of parts, a strike, an act of God, whatever, that may allow them to push back their deadline for having completed that. And in both of the cases that I'm thinking of, it was the same client, and they couldn't get the HVAC units. And so we went to the landlord and basically said, hey, here's the problem, and we need to move the commencement date back 30 days, 90 days, whatever. And they did it. And we never even used the word force majeure because, you know, it's a sophisticated landlord. They knew what the deal was. And so that was one way that we were able to deal with missing a date, even though that was not the fault of any of our people.
So how do you set up a system to track all these dates? I mean, when you have a renewal option, we picked up a client that missed their renewal option date by 1 day, and they couldn't renew, and the landlord had wanted them out anyway. So they had been mum on the topic because they were hoping they'd leave. And then we found them another space, but 1 day forced to move. So this stuff is really critical. Do they do it in-house? Do they have someone outside third-party firm? How do you keep track of this stuff?
Well, both landlord and tenant should be tracking critical dates. And so in the example you gave where they had to exercise an option by a certain date, if they don't, the leases typically state that time is of the essence, which basically means you do it on the day or by the day that it's required, or too bad. Whether you miss it by 1 day or 50 days, doesn't matter. You still lost your option. I'll give you a quick example. Back when I was on the landlord side, we had a tenant, which was one of the big accounting firms at that time. And they were in the middle of being acquired by another one of the big accounting firms. Well, they came to us and they said, hey, our lease expires here pretty quickly, and we would like to just do a 6-month term, extension of the lease because we don't really know what's going on yet. We're merging and we're trying to figure out who's on first and who's going to be in charge, whatever. So we just want to do a 6-month extension on the lease when we really don't want to be obligated to a longer term lease right now. Well, I talked to the guys I reported to, and one of them said, you know what, I think we can figure this out in a way that's really to our advantage. So we ended up going back to the tenant and said, look, we'll give you a 5-year extension option, or a 5-year extension of your lease, but you have the right to terminate within 6 months with 90 days notice. So what that really meant was, you can exercise your renewal, your termination option that will be effective in 6 months, but you have to give us 90 days notice, which meant that they had to actually give us the notice within 90 days, 3 months. Well, this guy who came up with this idea was betting that the chaos of a merger like that would prevent them from being able to really get their stuff together to actually terminate that lease. And we were very mum about it. We didn't say a word to anybody about it. Well, guess what? 3 weeks after that termination option notice date had occurred, we got a notice terminating the lease, to which our attorney replied and said, thank you very much. However, you missed your date. Time was of the essence. You're now on the hook for the full 5-year term of the lease. And they never used the space. And they were on the hook for 5 years. And now they did sublease their floors. That was two floors of space, like 40,000 square feet of space. And they sublet one floor. That subtenant flaked out on them. They subleased it again. Another floor, I think they sublet for some time. I think they did have a successful floor sublease at one point. But bottom line is, that critical date was really critical and they blew it. And, the landlord in that situation, who I worked for, really took advantage of the chaos that was going on of that merger at the time. So,
and folks, that's why we call it Confessions of a Recovering Landlord.
Yeah.
I mean, that was purposeful. You were laying in wait.
We absolutely were. And was it wrong, illegal, unethical, immoral? No. The job of those people at the time was to maximize the return on investment of their investors and to maximize the value of the building. And that was a great way to do it. You know, it wasn't.
But this was an accounting firm. They
I know.
live by numbers and dates. Why they didn't have something big red circle on their calendar going, Kyle Bob? It's
Well,
just
and
beyond me.
it was funny because their tenant rep at the time called me, who was the guy I knew well. And he says, "Are you guys really going to hold their feet to the fire on this?" And I said, "Absolutely." And he's like, "I don't blame you. I would too."
So it's Confessions of a Recovering Landlord and Recovering Tenant Rep.
Well, so, but your question was, how do they make sure they're not missing these dates? And so there's a couple of things. Number one, they need to put it on their calendars in some way that automatically will alert them. So the day they sign the lease, or more importantly, the day they have a commencement letter, because, you know, back to our timeline, we sign the lease. We don't know the commencement date of the lease at that moment in many cases because there's construction to be done. And so maybe the landlord's in charge of the construction, in which case the commencement date is a floating date. It depends on when they finish the work and hand the keys to the tenant. So let's just say we thought the commencement date was August 1. It turns out it's going to be October 15, and it was a 5-year lease. Well, October 15, 2023 does not mean that the expiration date is October 14, 2028, because the lease also says if the expiration date of the lease occurs in the middle of the month, then the expiration date is automatically pushed to the last day of the month that it would otherwise have expired. So it's actually October 31st, 2028. That'll be the expiration date of the lease. So you don't know that until the commencement date is established. But at that moment, they should go in and put on their calendar those dates. And when I say those dates, I mean the expiration date, the date of notice for every option that they have to renew, terminate, expand, whatever. And their tenant rep should do the same thing and should help them, which of course the lovely Jan Gibbons is the queen of. So, you know, we have a process called the lease track system. It's a proprietary process specific to REATA Commercial Realty that we make available to our clients. And it includes all those things. And you are the primary person managing that. So how do you manage that throughout the year for our clients?
Well, a lot of spreadsheets. I create a lease brief. Actually, Lucinda does it now for each lease. We redact it into a 1-page critical points, and then we put it into a spreadsheet. And every quarter, I sit down and review every lease. And if there's anything coming up, or even if there's not, I still reach out and say, "Hey, how's it going? Still happy with your space? Here's what we've got upcoming. You have a renewal expiration date. You're going to have a rent bump. You're going to have this. You're going to have that." And it's really fun to watch because I just did this September 15 for Q4, which starts October 1st. And I have people that write back and go, "Huh? What? When?" And then I have other people that say, "Confirming on my calendar. Thanks for the heads up." And I know they're tracking just as well as I am. And I love it. But I feel like I'm the fail-safe. They should be doing it. They should be on top of it. But I'm always going to be there to come behind them and remind them. And I'm happy to do it. It keeps me in front of them. It helps them know I'm here if you have any questions about, hey, I don't need all this space. I might need a sublease, or we got our operating expenses and holy cow, they were way off the chart. It just always lets them know I'm there and walking beside them. But yeah, the critical dates is one thing I really track, because like one of our largest clients has a lease in Fort Worth and they had a termination option available coming up to them. And so we discussed it for months in advance just to let them know this is what it would cost to buy it out. This is when you need to make notice by. And she's like, I don't want to do that. I just wanted to know about it, which is fine. It's another talking point. She probably had several people she had to talk to about it. That's why we're here.
And if that particular location had not been profitable at that moment, if it was
right,
you know, if it was losing money, then maybe terminating that lease would have made sense. And because that actually is one of the longest leases I've ever negotiated in my life.
Right.
And so it was a very long lease, and they had an option to terminate after 5 years and after 10 years. And this was the first option. And so they chose not to because they were, profitable. But had they not been, that would have been a smart move. Or if, let's say, they decided to shut down a location for whatever reason, if the location was tied to a customer under an underlying contract with one of their customers, and that contract went away, well, in that case, they might have wanted to terminate that lease. One of the things, about our lease track system is, a lot of people ask us about it, and they ask us, what software do you use to run that? And I chuckle because, as you pointed out, it's your little digits and and the spreadsheets. And I say, we make it be a very manual system on purpose, because we want to know that we're looking at it and putting thought behind it and communicating directly to that client based on what we know to be their issues at the time. Whereas there are software programs that are available that are lease track, or, they call them like lease administration software is sort of the term, where you, at the time you sign that lease and get your commencement notice, you put all kinds of data in there, and it will spit out automatic notices to you at the time. And some of them are actually so comprehensive that there are companies that just do lease administration, or they're divisions of companies, like the big companies like JLL and CBRE, et cetera. They have departments for lease administration, and it's an additional cost to the client, usually billed on a dollars per month per lease basis. And, if you have 1,000 leases, that probably makes a lot of sense, because it's hard to keep track of that kind of stuff on a spreadsheet. But if you're not that big, that's probably overkill. But I don't want to rely on just some machine spitting out something that was input into a system 5 years ago and hoping it's still right. So
the other thing I like about it is we talk about our clients in between this quarterly review system. And I like to reach out to my agents as I'm preparing the emails to go out and say, hey, this guy had some trouble with his HVAC system. He and the landlord were going back and forth. Did y'all get that corrected? Do I need to touch base on it again? And I just really like it because it looks like we're talking to each other over the scope of issues, and everyone's in the know and they feel taken care of. Okay, I want to talk about one that could have other kinds of consequences.
Okay.
What if they miss a rent payment date? Now, what remedies are available to said landlord?
Of allowing that tenant to go find another place to do business.
Or encouraging them on a Friday night about 11 o'clock, locked out.
So when I was probably 23 years old, I was already in the commercial real estate business, had been in it for two and a half years. And I needed to go collect rent from a tenant who, I was on the landlord side at that point. And the tenant had not been paying.
Technically, but that's beside the point.
That's a technical term. And they hadn't paid the rent, and this had been a chronic problem. So I met out there at their place at 8 o'clock on a Friday morning with a locksmith, and we changed the locks. That's one of the remedies landlords have. If you don't pay the rent, then they can put you in default. And if they put you in default, depending on the rules of your state, they then have to post a notice on your space that says, notice is hereby being given. And I don't, there's a lot of legal language you have to put in there. But bottom line, it's like, pay up within a certain period of time or we're going to change the locks. And I've changed the locks on tenants many times back when I was on a landlord side. Since I've been on the tenant side, I've never had a client get locked out, thank goodness. But the landlord has that right to do that. So that is a catastrophic problem. If you cannot conduct your business, if you're not inside that space, and you can't put your employees inside that space, you may be out of business. and they're
well,
not.
The landlord can also take the contents depending on how the
Well,
lease is worded.
You're getting a little ahead of the program there, the timeline. But bottom line is the first step is they can lock you out. Now, let's back up even before that. The first step really is a late payment penalty. So
Yeah.
the lease says if you don't pay on time, I can charge you, if I'm the landlord, I can charge you a late payment penalty. That late payment penalty can be a fixed dollar amount, $100, $300, $1,000, whatever. It can be a percentage of the amount of money you owe them. And if you don't pay them within a certain number of days, like 10 days or something, then they can also start charging interest on the amount you owe until it's paid. So you have the late payment penalty and the interest on the amount owed until it's paid. So that's the first thing. And that's a slap on the wrist for not having delivered the money on time. And that's totally fine, totally appropriate. I don't have any problem with that. Some leases, however, will say that you are in default if you don't pay the rent on time. Well, that means the first of the month. So on the second day of the month, you're already in default, even though your late payment penalty may not kick in until after 5 days. So you're in default, but you haven't even gotten the late payment penalty. So the slap on the wrist hasn't even occurred yet, and they're already hitting you with a sledgehammer. And now that doesn't mean that just because you're in technical default on the lease that the landlord's going to exercise their remedies, of which locking a tenant out is one of them. But it means they have the right to do that. So guess
they're going to hold it over you.
Well, they could hold it over you, but one of the other remedies is they can terminate the lease and accelerate all the rents. Well, when would they want to terminate a lease and not continue working with you? Because, they're in the business to get rent. That's what they want. That's what gives buildings value. But if you're a small tenant and you happen to be next door to a big tenant who wants your space because they're growing and they can't get it because you have a lease and you miss your date and you're now in default, you may not get to enter that space again, except to clear it out. And they may give that space to the tenant next door. And you never want to put yourself in a position where you've given the landlord rights that they wouldn't otherwise have had it not been for you messing up. So, one of the things we recommend when we recommend changes in a lease is that in the default language where it says you're in default if you don't pay the rent on time, we say, no. Just because the United States Postal Service didn't deliver the check to the landlord when they were supposed to, doesn't mean the tenant should be in default. The landlord should be required to give the tenant notice that the rent didn't arrive and give them, 3 days, 5 days, whatever, to pay the rent. Now, if they don't pay the rent, all right, fine, you're in default. You're an idiot for not having paid the rent in the first place, and you're an even bigger idiot for not having paid it the second, when you've been told about it. So, if there are remedies the landlord wants to exercise at that point, well, that's within their rights and there's no problem. But we want to make sure that the lease at least gives the tenant that notice period so that they are aware of it. Now, one way to deal with that, of course, is to set up an ACH to pay your rent every month. And more people are doing that. I think that's the best thing to do to avoid this kind of thing. Don't leave it up to the Postal Service to make sure you don't get locked out of your space. Right. So those are a couple of things on paying the rent that I think are pretty crucial.
Okay. What about an option to renew?
Get one.
Okay, next.
Well, an option to renew. Yeah, you want to have the option to renew, and that's going to say that you have to exercise that option by a certain date or within a window of 6 to 9 months prior, or 12 to 15 months prior, whatever it is. So you always want to get that option because it's a reservation for your space, so the landlord can't lease it out to somebody else. If you don't have a renewal option and that big tenant next door wants to expand in your space, well, the landlord could sign a lease for that tenant to take your space at the expiration of your lease, and you have no say about it. You're forced to move at that point. So getting a renewal option helps to prevent that. Now, the landlord may also have the right to relocate the tenant in the building if there is other space that is available, but that's another issue. So you want to get the renewal option, but you never want to exercise it. So several months before the date by which you have to give notice to exercise your renewal option, you want to be talking to your tenant rep. You want to be coming up with a strategy for, what you're going to do about your lease. And I had this exact conversation with a client yesterday that has a lease renewal date that is coming up. And and I said, look, or he asked me, what happens if I don't exercise my option on that date? And I was like, he's in an office building. I said, in normal circumstances, the landlord could go lease your space out from under you to someone else, but it's office space and there's not a lot of demand for office space these days. So it's not likely that that's going to happen. So as a strategic move, we may just let that date pass. And, that might give the landlord a little scare and might, make them think, well, oh, maybe they're not worried about this and maybe they're moving, and they might get a little more serious about their negotiation. But anyway, bottom line is on renewal options. We've talked a lot about renewal options in other episodes, so I won't go too much into it, but bottom line is you want to be negotiating with your landlord months before that exercise date occurs. And you want to be talking to other landlords in the market so you know what your options are. So then you can decide whether or not to exercise that renewal option. I would say you don't want to do that. Never put yourself in a position where you have to ask yourself, should I exercise it? But anyway.
So let's flip the tables now. What about, I've paid my security deposit, I've moved in, I've stayed there my 5 years, now I've decided to move out and go somewhere else. Isn't there a time frame by which the landlord must give me back my security deposit? How does that work?
Hopefully, more and more leases are saying in a reasonable amount of time. It used to be pretty standard that it was within 30 days of the expiration date of the lease. I'm now seeing more and more 60 days, 90 days, or just a reasonable amount of time, or I'll use my best efforts to give you that money back someday. It can be pretty general in their description, but we always try to put a specific date by it. 60 days to me seems rational. And the bottom line is that, you as the tenant want to make sure that you've prepared your landlord and given them every opportunity to work with you to make sure that they're going to give you your money back. What I mean by that is that, even though the lease doesn't require that you give them notice that you're not going to be renewing your lease or staying in the building, and it doesn't require you to give notice that you're leaving either. You can just, at the end of the lease, just move out and you're done. But I don't think that's reasonable. You should give the landlord notice that you're not going to be staying in the building and that you're going to be moving out. Say, we expect we're going to be moving out on the weekend of whatever. And so let's say you're going to move out the weekend of September 23, and you tell the landlord, the lease expires in September 30th. I'd like to schedule a time with you to walk the space with the property manager on September 26. And that way we can, discuss any issues that are outstanding. If they don't feel like you've cleaned it properly or that you've left damage, you can take photos of it. You can agree on who's going to take care of, fixing that situation, that problem, because the landlord has no incentive whatsoever to manage your money properly.
Right.
And so you want to have that opportunity to deal with it if you want to, and get a better price than what they're going to get, because they're going to just take whatever that cost is out of your security deposit and refund you the balance. So don't give them that opportunity. Clean the space, move the stuff out on time, and make sure you have that walkthrough with them before the expiration date so that you can handle that.
So obviously there's lots of dates that we could keep going down through 100 pages of leases, but these are just kind of some of the most common ones that are discussed. So we just kind of wanted to talk about it, and just the most important thing is, once you have a lease in place, have someone monitoring these dates. When they come up, what you have to do, what's your window of opportunity for notifying whomever needs to be notified for whatever, just to be aware and make sure someone's on top of it. Here at REATA Commercial Realty, we do it for you.
At no additional cost.
At no additional cost.
One other thing, there are expansion options, there are termination options.
Yeah, no, there's a ton that we didn't go over.
And all of those have dates associated with them. So, just suffice to say, put those dates on your calendar.
Absolutely.
Long before those dates occur, be talking about strategy and what it is you're trying to accomplish and, that kind of thing. So it's really, really important that those things be discussed. Ideally, I like to have an annual strategy meeting with clients just to say, all right, it's been a year since your lease was signed and you moved in. How's the space working for you?
Right.
It's been 3 years. You got 2 years left on your lease. How's it working for you? Are you thinking you're going to need to, expand early, reduce your space, whatever, those kinds of discussions, you have them frequently, annually with your advisor. It's going to set you up a whole lot better to avoid missing dates or being caught in some situation where you don't have the right amount of space you need for what you're doing.
When you haven't had the time to consider it. That's why you got to have that window.
Well, and also certain things like if you want to build a building from dirt, from ground up, and you need a lot of time. You can't be doing that with 12 months left on your lease, even 18. You need a lot more time. And if you're wanting to buy a building, buildings don't just show up on the market ready to be bought at the time you want them. So, we usually will start 2 or more years before a lease expires when we're looking for something like that. And, we've had it take 3 years in one case to find the right building. We've had it take 2 years in another case. Those are both longer than normal, but
specific use, very specific use.
Yeah. The more specific, the longer it can take. But you want to be able to be thinking about all that kind of stuff. And it may be as simple as, are you financeable? Can you go out and get a loan for a building, with your company in the condition it's in currently? You might need to, improve a few things on your balance sheet before you're going to get a bank to give you the money. Right. So be thinking about all those kinds of things. And that's why the more you're talking and planning, you'll have a better strategy that it can actually be implemented.
Thanks for joining us again for Confessions. It was real confessions this time of a recovering landlord. We're always here to keep you informed. See you next time.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. And just a reminder to send in questions to see if we can stump Bob.
Not going to happen.
We really appreciate your taking the time to tune into this episode. We would love it if you would give us a 5-star rating on whatever platform you're listening to this on. And if you are on our YouTube channel, we would love to read your feedback in the comment section. Also, be sure to subscribe so you get notified when we publish new episodes. Thanks, and see you next time.
Bye.